The night was thick with silence, interrupted only by the shuffling of feet against cracked pavement. Andre glanced around, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, shoulders hunched against the cold. He had a strange feeling, a creeping unease that made his skin prickle. Andre thought, just keep walking. Just get out of here. A car slowed down behind him, headlights sweeping the street like searching eyes. Andre quickened his pace, trying not to look back. The music from the car grew louder, an old, almost mocking tune. He didn't want to run, didn't want to show fear, but his heart pounded like a warning drum. The car stopped. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate. Andre turned, barely catching a glimpse of the masked figure before something struck him. The ground came up fast, and the world spun. Darkness folded in as he was dragged toward the open trunk. Chris sat on the edge of the bed, staring into the bathroom mirror. His hands rested on his knees, knuckles white and tense. He couldn't shake the thought from his mind, no matter how hard he tried. Chris thought, what if the way they see me isn't really me? Rose stepped out of the bathroom, towel in hand, hair slightly damp. She smiled at him, the kind of carefree smile that seemed almost too pure for the world. Rose said, "Hey, are you okay? You've been quiet since we started packing." Chris forced a grin, but it barely touched his eyes. Chris said, "Yeah, just thinking. It's a big step, meeting your parents." Rose laughed softly, dismissing his worry. Rose said, "Relax. They're going to love you, I promise." But Chris couldn't help the gnawing unease in his chest. He wanted to believe her, wanted to convince himself that it would be fine, that her family wouldn't care about his skin color, that his gut feeling was just paranoia. He glanced back at the mirror, catching his own reflection. His face looked different somehow, unfamiliar, like someone else was staring back. Chris thought, maybe I'm just overthinking it, or maybe I'm right to be afraid. Rose tossed a sweater into the open suitcase, humming to herself. She looked up, catching Chris still lost in thought. Rose said, "Come on, you don't have to worry about anything. They're just people." Chris said, "Yeah, people." He tried to smile again, but it faltered. In the back of his mind, the question still echoed. What if he wasn't being paranoid? What if he was right? They drove through winding country roads, sunlight streaming through the trees in fragmented patterns. Rose hummed softly, her fingers drumming on the steering wheel. Chris stared out the window, his mind wandering between anxious thoughts and fragmented memories. Rose said, "You're quiet again." Chris said, "Just thinking." Rose reached over and squeezed his hand, giving him a reassuring smile. Rose said, "I promise, it's going to be fine. Dad's a little goofy, but he means well. And Mom, well, she's intense, but sweet. They're gonna love you." Chris gave a half-hearted smile, but his mind remained clouded. His fingers tapped nervously on his thigh, as if trying to shake off a feeling that clung to him like fog. Suddenly, a shadow darted across the road. The car lurched to the side as something struck the hood, a dull, sickening thud. Rose slammed the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. Rose said, "Oh my God, did you see that?" Chris's heart pounded. He looked back, trying to process what just happened. Chris said, "I think it was a deer." They both got out, cautiously approaching the front of the car. The headlight was cracked, and a smear of blood trailed off toward the trees. Chris moved closer, peering into the woods. A faint, painful bleat echoed from the shadows. Chris said, "It's still alive." Rose looked away, uneasy. Rose said, "Let's just go." But Chris remained rooted, staring into the darkness. His own memories pressed against his thoughts, the night his mother never came home. The helplessness of waiting. He couldn't move. Couldn't just leave it there. Rose touched his arm gently. Rose said, "Chris, it's just a deer." Chris nodded, but the weight on his chest didn't lighten. They got back into the car, silence hanging between them like a ghost. Inside the Armitage dining room, the atmosphere was tense despite the hearty meal. Jeremy, Rose's brother, sat across from Chris, his gaze sharp and uncomfortably fixed. Dean, Missy and Rose tried to keep the conversation light, but Jeremy's energy was wild and unpredictable. Jeremy said, "So Chris, you ever do any fighting? Like, mixed martial arts?" Chris hesitated, unsure how to respond to the sudden shift in topic. Chris said, "Nah, not really. I did some judo when I was a kid, but..." Jeremy leaned forward, his tone both challenging and curious. Jeremy said, "Man, with your frame and genetic makeup, you'd be a beast if you pushed your body. I'm just saying, you ever think about, like, going full-on training?" Rose shot her brother a warning look, but he didn't seem to notice. Dean tried to diffuse the tension with a loud, forced laugh. Dean said, "All right, Jeremy, enough about that. Let's just enjoy dinner." But the air was thick with something unspoken, and Chris couldn't shake the feeling that Jeremy wasn't just making casual conversation. There was something darker lurking behind his words, a hint of violence barely contained. Chris forced a smile, but inside, his gut twisted with unease. Later that night, Chris lay in bed, staring at the darkened ceiling. The house was quiet, but his mind was loud, replaying Jeremy's words and that strange look in his eyes. He needed some air. Stepping outside, he lit a cigarette, the smoke swirling in the cool night breeze. Suddenly, he saw something move at the edge of the yard. Walter, the groundskeeper, sprinting across the lawn, fast and determined, as if chasing something unseen. Chris froze, his heart pounding. Before he could process what he'd seen, the light from the kitchen flickered on. Through the window he saw Georgina, motionless, staring at her own reflection with a vacant smile. It was eerie, like she was frozen in time. Chris thought, "What is wrong with these people?" The door behind him creaked open, and Missy appeared, her voice soft and calm. Missy said, "Can't sleep?" Chris nodded, too unsettled to speak. Missy gestured for him to follow her back inside. Sitting across from her in the dimly lit office, Chris felt a strange sense of vulnerability. Missy's soothing voice filled the room, and the faint clink of a silver spoon against a teacup punctuated her words. Missy said, "Sometimes we just need to let go of the things that weigh on us." She stirred the tea rhythmically, the sound almost hypnotic. Chris tried to focus, but his mind was foggy, as if the room itself was pressing in on him. Missy said, "Tell me about your mother." Chris tensed, memories flooding back, waiting alone as a child, hoping his mother would come home. The guilt, the helplessness. Missy's voice seemed to slip past his defenses. Missy said, "It's not your fault, you know. You were just a child." Chris tried to move, to get up, but his body felt heavy, rooted to the chair. Missy's eyes were fixed on his, her words blending with the rhythmic clinking. Missy said, "Sink. Sink into the floor." Chris felt himself falling, plunging into darkness. His body remained rigid in the chair, but his mind was drifting down, down into the void. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move, trapped in a space between sleep and waking. He could still see Missy through the narrowing tunnel of his vision, her face calm and composed as his world faded to black. Missy said, "Now you're in the sunken place." Chris wanted to scream, to fight, but he couldn't move. He was falling endlessly, his consciousness detached from his body, sinking into the dark abyss. He watched through a distorted, narrow window as Missy calmly sipped her tea, unmoved by his terror. The sunken place was vast, cold, and inescapable. When Chris awoke, he was back in his bed, drenched in sweat. He sat up abruptly, gasping for air. His hands trembled as he tried to gather his thoughts. The house was silent, as if nothing had happened, but the dread clung to him, heavy and unshakable. He glanced at his phone, no messages from Rose. The nightmare felt too vivid, too real. He rubbed his temples, trying to convince himself it was just a bad dream. Yet deep down, he knew something had changed. He couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, of being trapped within a body he no longer controlled. Chris awoke to the sound of birds outside the window. Sunlight streamed through the thin curtains, bathing the room in a soft glow. He sat up slowly, rubbing his temples. The previous night felt like a fragmented nightmare, vivid yet surreal. Chris thought, was it real or just a bad dream? Rose was still asleep beside him, breathing softly. Chris moved carefully, not wanting to wake her. His hands still felt heavy, as if the weight from the chair had followed him into the morning. He touched his phone, glancing at the screen, no messages from Rod. A wave of unease settled over him. It wasn't just the hypnosis or the nightmare. It was the house itself, the people within it. Something wasn't right. Rose stirred, blinking awake. She smiled sleepily, unaware of his turmoil. Rose said, "Morning, you okay?" Chris hesitated. Chris said, "Yeah, just didn't sleep well." Rose sat up, stretching, completely unaware of the tension in Chris's shoulders. Rose said, "It's just nerves. Meeting the family and all, but everyone loves you already." Chris forced a nod, though his thoughts were elsewhere. He couldn't shake the image of Missy, the rhythmic sound of the spoon, the darkness swallowing him whole. He couldn't tell Rose couldn't risk sounding paranoid. Downstairs, the house was bustling with preparations. Dean was setting up tables in the garden, while Missy arranged flowers on the porch. A few cars were already arriving, guests stepping out in their polished best. Dean noticed Chris at the top of the stairs and waved cheerfully. Dean said, "Morning, hope you slept well. Big day today, annual family gathering." Chris gave a faint smile, still feeling detached from his surroundings. He could hear voices in the garden, laughter mixed with the clinking of glasses. Rose appeared behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. Rose said, "You good? You seem off." Chris said, "Yeah, just need some air." He stepped outside, trying to gather his thoughts. Guests greeted him warmly, overly curious about his life and background. Each handshake felt too firm, every smile too wide. An older man, dressed impeccably, approached him. Man said, "You must be Rose's friend. Quite the catch. You golf, young man?" Chris shook his head politely. Chris said, "No, not really." The man chuckled, patting him on the shoulder. Man said, "You should try it. Strong build like yours. Perfect for the game." Chris forced a smile, his skin prickling. There was something unsettling about the way they looked at him, as if he were a prize on display. He caught sight of Georgina carrying a tray of drinks, her movements stiff and mechanical. Chris thought, why do they all act so off? As more guests gathered, Chris couldn't escape the feeling of being scrutinized. He moved to the edge of the garden, trying to put distance between himself and the suffocating crowd. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw another black man standing alone near the hedge. Chris approached cautiously, curious and relieved to see someone who might understand his unease. Logan turned around, his face immediately brightening with a wide, unnatural grin. Logan said, Hello. Nice to meet you. Wonderful day, isn't it?" Chris forced a smile. Chris said, "Yeah, sure is." But something about Logan was off his clothes. His tone, even his posture seemed dated, like he didn't belong. Chris couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. Chris couldn't put his finger on it, but something about Logan was undeniably off. The man's suit looked outdated, like it was plucked from a distant past, and his demeanor, polite, overly formal, felt rehearsed. Chris said, "So how long you been here?" Logan's smile didn't waver. Logan said, "Oh, not long. Just a few months. It's lovely here. Very comfortable." Chris could feel his unease growing. He glanced around, noticing how the other guests seemed to steal glances their way, subtly, as if curious about their interaction. Chris thought, why do they keep staring? He pulled out his phone, pretending to check messages, but really just trying to ground himself. Without warning, he snapped a picture of Logan, hoping to send it to Rod later. The flash accidentally went off, startling both of them. Logan's entire demeanor changed. His expression twisted into something almost feral, and his eyes widened in a panic. Logan shouted, "Get out! Get out of here!" Chris stepped back, stunned. Logan's voice had become desperate, almost pleading. Rose rushed over, alarmed. Rose said, "What happened?" Dean and Missy appeared too, quickly pulling Logan away. Missy whispered something to him, soothing, and he seemed to calm down, his face going blank again. A few of the guests whispered among themselves, trying to downplay the outburst. Dean laughed awkwardly. Dean said, "Seizure. Happens sometimes. Poor guy." Chris didn't buy it. Logan's reaction wasn't just a medical incident. It was fear. Raw, unfiltered fear. Later, in the quiet of their room, Chris tried to explain it to Rose. Chris said, "It wasn't just a seizure. He seemed terrified, like he was trying to warn me." Rose frowned, shaking her head. Rose said, "You're overthinking it. It's just stress. Everyone's been so nice to you. Don't let one weird moment ruin the weekend." Chris wanted to believe her, but something gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the image of Logan's wild, desperate eyes. When Rose stepped out, Chris quickly dialed Rod's number. It took a few rings before his friend picked up. Rod said, "Yo, what's up?" Chris kept his voice low. Chris said, "Rod, man, something's wrong here. This dude freaked out when I took his picture. Screamed at me to get out. It wasn't just weird. It was like he was warning me." Rod snorted. Rod said, "Man, I told you. White people at country houses? They're all about that brainwashing cult stuff. You gotta leave." Chris tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. Chris said, "I'm serious. There's something wrong. These people, they're acting too nice too. Interested in me. It's creepy." Rod said, "Listen, just bounce. If it feels wrong, it's wrong. You hear me?" Chris hesitated, glancing at the door as if expecting someone to be listening. Chris said, "Yeah, I hear you." He hung up, trying to process everything. Rose came back, catching his uneasy look. Rose said, "You okay?" Chris forced a smile. Chris said, "Yeah, just tired." But inside, his instinct screamed at him. Something about this place wasn't right. He needed to get out. Before it was too late. Chris sat on the edge of the bed, trying to control his breathing. His mind was racing, Logan's outburst, the unsettling feeling gnawing at his gut. He couldn't shake the sense that something was terribly wrong. He needed answers. He glanced at Rose, who was talking with her family downstairs. Taking a deep breath, Chris quietly opened the door and slipped out, moving down the hallway. He had seen a room earlier, one Dean had locked quickly when they arrived. Now, with the house mostly empty as guests lingered outside, he approached it cautiously. The door was ajar. Inside, faint light spilled from a computer screen. Chris stepped in, his heart pounding. On the desk were photos, hundreds of them showing Rose with different black men. Some of the faces he recognized, including Logan. Each picture captured Rose looking affectionate, loving, but the men looked almost vacant. Chris whispered, "What the hell?" He scrolled through the computer and found videos, medical procedures, old film reels of what looked like brain surgery. One title read, "Transcendence Procedure." His stomach twisted. The truth hit him hard and fast. They weren't just hypnotizing people, they were replacing them, taking their bodies, making them into something else. Chris heard footsteps. He shut the computer and moved quickly back to the bedroom, his mind spiraling. As he closed the door, Rose entered, smiling brightly. Rose said, "Hey, you good? You've been quiet." Chris forced a nod, his heart racing. He needed to play it cool, act normal. He couldn't risk revealing his suspicions, not yet. Dinner that night felt suffocating. Dean kept making grandiose speeches about unity, evolution, and progress. Missy poured wine, her eyes flicking to Chris every now and then, as if gauging his reaction. Jeremy leaned back, smirking, tapping his fork rhythmically against his plate. Dean said, "We've come so far, haven't we? The human mind, it's limitless if you know how to harness it. Imagine living forever, your consciousness preserved." Chris forced a laugh. Chris said, "Sounds ambitious." Rose squeezed his hand, her touch feeling colder than before. After dinner, Chris whispered to Rose, urging her to leave. He framed it as a romantic getaway, suggesting they take off early in the morning. Rose hesitated but agreed with a smile. In the dead of night, Chris began packing his things. He glanced out the window, seeing Walter pacing in the garden, his movements stiff and mechanical. Georgina was polishing windows, her reflection eerily calm. Suddenly, the door creaked open. Missy stood there, holding the silver spoon and teacup. Chris froze. Missy said, "Leaving so soon?" Chris tried to muster a casual tone. Chris said, "Yeah, just. Thought we'd head out early." Missy's face remained unreadable. She set the cup down and began stirring. Missy said, "You're tense. Let me help you relax." Chris shook his head, backing away. Chris said, "I'm good, really." But the rhythmic clink of the spoon against the cup made his vision blur. His hands started to tremble, and the world around him faded. Missy said, "Sink." Chris's mind tumbled backward, his body rigid but his consciousness falling deep into the void. The sunken place engulfed him, his screams muted, his movements frozen. Through the haze, he saw Rose enter, her expression shifting from concern to a chilling calmness. Rose said, "He's ready." Chris's last thought before the darkness took over was a single, desperate plea. Get out. Darkness. The sunken place. Chris could barely see through the narrow window of his own consciousness. He could hear voices, Dean's calm, clinical tone, Jeremy's muffled laugh, Rose's sweet but detached reply. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating. Chris thought, "I'm not done. I'm not giving up." Through sheer will, Chris began to move his fingers. Slowly he clawed back some control. He focused on the faint light, pushing against the numbness that enveloped him. Time slipped by. When Chris finally awoke, he found himself strapped to a wooden chair in a dimly lit room. A television flickered in front of him, showing a grainy video of Dean explaining the procedure, the transplantation of consciousness from one body to another. Dean said, on video, "You won't be gone entirely. A piece of you will remain, observing but unable to control. It's a privilege, really." Chris thrashed against the restraints, heart pounding. He noticed something sharp sticking out of the chair's arm, a loose nail. With calculated movements, he began scraping his wrist against it, slowly loosening the strap. The door creaked open. Jeremy entered, humming softly, holding a surgical tray. Chris kept still, pretending to be unconscious. Jeremy said, "Time to get prepped, man. Big day." As Jeremy leaned in, Chris sprang to life, freeing one hand and driving the nail into Jeremy's thigh. Jeremy howled in pain, stumbling backward. Chris tackled him to the ground, slamming his head against the floor repeatedly until Jeremy went limp. Breathing hard, Chris grabbed the keys from Jeremy's pocket and hurriedly unlocked the other restraints. He knew he didn't have much time. The house was too quiet, like the calm before a storm. He moved cautiously through the hallways, hearing faint chatter from the living room. As he approached the front door, Georgina appeared suddenly, blocking his way, her expression blank. Georgina said, "You shouldn't be here." Chris swallowed his fear and moved past her, but she grabbed his arm with unnatural strength. Desperate, he shoved her aside, sprinting out the door. Outside, Walter appeared, sprinting after him. Chris reached the car, fumbling with the keys, when Walter tackled him to the ground. The two struggled fiercely, but Chris managed to grab a nearby shovel, knocking Walter unconscious. Just as he started the car, Rose appeared on the porch holding a rifle, her face finally devoid of affection, replaced by cold indifference. Rose shouted, "Stop! You can't leave, Chris." Chris sped down the driveway, glancing back to see Rose calmly loading the rifle. He didn't get far before Georgina suddenly darted in front of the car. The impact sent her flying. Against his instincts, Chris stopped, feeling an overwhelming sense of guilt. He got out, lifted Georgina into the car, but as they drove, she suddenly attacked him, screaming incoherently. Georgina shouted, "You ruined it. You ruined everything." Chris lost control, swerving and crashing into a tree. Dazed, he crawled out, blood trickling from his forehead. He saw Rose approaching, rifle in hand, calm and predatory. Then, a car approached, headlights cutting through the dark. It was Rod. Relief washed over Chris as he stumbled towards the car. Rod said, "Get in, now." As they sped away, Chris looked back to see Rose standing on the road, expression unreadable. The weight of everything that had happened hit him hard: betrayal, horror, the narrow escape from death. He sank into the passenger seat, his body trembling with exhaustion and shock. Rod glanced at him, his tone a mix of relief and disbelief. Rod said, "Told you not to go to the white people's house." Chris didn't laugh. He couldn't. The adrenaline had left his system, and what remained was a hollow ache in his chest. He wiped the blood from his forehead, his fingers trembling. The passing trees blurred together, but his mind remained sharp, replaying every chilling moment. Chris thought, "I almost didn't make it. I almost." Rod kept talking, his words a distant hum. Chris stared out the window, the reality of his survival slowly sinking in. He wanted to scream, cry, something, anything to release the suffocating pressure building inside. But he just sat there, numb and cold. Finally, Rod glanced at him again, his voice softening. Rod said, "You good, man?" Chris nodded, not trusting his voice. The night stretched out ahead of them, vast and unforgiving. Rod reached over, patting his shoulder lightly. Rod said, "You're safe now. We're going home." But even as the road stretched out before them, Chris knew he would never truly escape what had happened. The Armitage house was behind him, but its shadows would follow him for a long time.